The rain hovered in the clouds like a held breath when Daniel pulled his SUV into the overlook above the river. I could smell cedar and wet stone. He kept the engine on, and the lights trained across the guardrail, turning the mist into a wall of glowing silver. "Get out, Lena. You need to learn respect." His voice sounded careful and steady. Careful was always how he did harm. I pressed record on my phone while I nodded as if I agreed, slid the phone into my coat pocket, and opened the door. The air wrapped around me cool and metallic. He did not look at me as I stepped down. The locks clicked, and the vehicle rolled backward and then forward as he shifted into drive. He thought distance would teach me obedience. He did not know that distance had already taught me clarity. I watched the taillights sink into the trees and counted softly. I had practiced the count until it lived in my bones. 30 counts until the glow vanished. 90, until the sound of the engine became only wind. When it was quiet, the night opened and I could hear the river. It sounded like a crowd whispering. I stood at the wet guardrail and breathed until the first pinpricks of rain found my cheeks. The cold sharpened my focus. In my pocket, the screen warmed my hand with a gentle pulse. The recording was capturing the words he had chosen so precisely. "You need to learn respect." He liked to make lessons sound like concern. He liked to use marriage as a classroom where only he could grade. Headlights eased around the bend. A black pickup rolled to a stop behind the overlook sign. Theo stepped out with a hood up and a thermos in his fist. My brother moved with the patient caution of a man who has learned to enter a room without raising heartbeats. He handed me the thermos and an umbrella, got him on audio. I lifted the phone, clean as a bell. He scanned the trees, then the road behind. No other cars, no curious eyes, just rain and our breath. My chest loosened for the first time all evening. We climbed into the truck. The heater hummed. The windows fogged at the edges and cleared again under the defroster. Theo drove with 2 fingers resting lightly on the wheel and checked the mirrors at regular intervals. In the cup holder, the thermos knocked gently with each curve. I took a careful sip. The coffee tasted like smoke and chocolate. It pulled me back to mornings in our mother's kitchen when I was a kid, and the day still felt fixable. I watched the map on the dash as our blue dot moved along county roads we had traced a dozen times. We had rehearsed these turns with the precision of stage blocking. Theo had tested the drive at different hours to mark where patrol cars idled and where delivery trucks parked overnight. He had called in favors at the small hotel near the marina, and trained the night clerk to write incident notes that would be useful later. Everything we did would be ordinary and also recorded. I remembered the first day I knew I had to plan for exit. It was not a loud day. It was a morning at our dining table. Daniel laughed when I asked about a transfer I did not recognize. He kissed my forehead and told me I was sweet and naive, and that the tax world was complicated. He made oatmeal and left his phone face down and humming. When he went to shower, I turned the phone and saw a message from a contact labeled Wellness. The message thanked him for arranging a weekend away and included a photo of 2 glasses by a pool I had never seen. I looked out the window at our neighbor's dog trotting past with a tennis ball and felt a new stillness arrive inside my chest. Stillness is what you feel when you stop asking for kindness from someone who treats it like a favor. Theo took a side road that ran along an orchard. The trees were gray sticks in the rain, and the ground smelled like apples and soil. He glanced at me, and then back to the road. "Priya is ready for the overnight package, the bank statements, the cards." The camera pulls. Maya has the temporary orders drafted and a judge who is not impressed by theatrics. He said it like he was reading a grocery list because steady language keeps fear from growing teeth. I nodded. My hands were steady on the thermos now. My voice matched. "We will check in at the marina, and the clerk will write that I was shaking and quiet and soaked. The record will show that I asked for water. The security camera will catch the timestamp. The card will log the payment. Daniel believes paper can be bent. We will hand the court paper that refuses to fold." The rain thickened and the wipers kept time. I let my eyes close for a breath and opened them again. The road unspooled ahead. Behind us, the overlook was only a memory of white lights behind wet branches. I thought of the promise I had made to myself weeks ago, when Theo placed the last sensor in the den, and Priya labeled the final folder. If Daniel ever forced a lesson, I would end the class. Tonight he had delivered the prompt, now I would deliver the grade. The Marina Hotel sat low to the ground, built of brick that had darkened over decades of salt air and rain. Theo parked under the awning, killed the lights, and gave me a nod that said we had arrived exactly as we'd rehearsed. The clerk on duty, a college kid with tired eyes, handed me towels without needing to be asked. His training from Maya had been simple. Observe, write down, timestamp. I let my hands shake as I scribbled my maiden name on the registry and whispered that my husband had left me on the road. The clerk wrote every word in the incident log. Theo stood just behind, large enough to be noticed, but quiet enough not to overshadow. Everything was being recorded exactly as we needed. Inside the room, I peeled off my wet coat, hung it on the metal chair, and changed into the clothes I'd stashed the week before. The fabric smelled faintly of lavender detergent, a reminder that planning for safety sometimes feels like ordinary housekeeping. I sank onto the bed, listening to the rain hammer against the window. For a moment, exhaustion pressed hard into my chest. But then I thought back to the slow years of control that had led here, and the fatigue turned into resolve. Daniel's lessons had never started with storms. They began with whispers. Early in our marriage, he told me my laugh was too loud for dinner parties. Then he said my parents called too often, that I was letting them meddle. He discouraged me from applying for a promotion at the firm, insisting travel would ruin our marriage. He framed each restriction as a kindness, each dismissal as wisdom. By the time I realized the pattern, my world had shrunk to the size of his moods. When he finally shoved a copied key into his mother's hand, telling her she could drop by any time, family doesn't need permission, I understood the extent of the invasion. Privacy was a privilege he thought he could revoke at will. I remembered one Thanksgiving when my mother Evelyn had overcooked the turkey and laughed at herself. Daniel leaned across the table and muttered that dignity was slipping away from her, that maybe she wasn't safe to handle family assets anymore. The remark lodged in me like a thorn. He had already spotted her occasional forgetfulness, already plotting how to use it. When Harper, my younger sister, fell into debt with the wrong crowd, Daniel was the first to offer help. I thought it was compassion. Later I saw the pattern, collecting weaknesses like coins he could spend when convenient. Priya had once explained it best over coffee at her kitchen table. People like Daniel build a scaffolding of small cuts until you forget what unmarked skin feels like. She tapped her mug, steady and calm. That's why documentation matters. It proves the cuts were real when everyone else insists they were just scratches. Tonight I clutched my phone with Daniel's voice on it, and for the first time I believed we had enough. Theo checked the locks twice, set the umbrella against the wall, and dropped into the armchair. He had been patient for years, watching from the sidelines, biting his tongue every holiday when Daniel's mother praised her son for being such a devoted husband. Theo knew devotion had a different face. He had seen mine in the bathroom mirror after nights when arguments ended with me questioning my memory, my sanity, even my worth. Now he was here, not to fight Daniel with fists, but with records, timestamps, and sworn affidavits. His presence in the corner chair was a reminder that family could be armor when chosen carefully. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling where shadows from the rain streaked like rivers. Daniel believed he had written the script, wife abandoned, lesson delivered, contrition demanded. But the truth was that his lines had become my evidence, his arrogance the final nail in a case I had been building in secret. The storm outside sounded less like danger now, and more like applause. Tomorrow would begin the process of unraveling everything he had constructed. Tonight was the first night in years I felt the promise of safety. The morning light pushed through the thin curtains, pale and uncertain. I had been awake for hours, sitting at the desk with my laptop open to the shared account Daniel thought I never checked. The balance had shifted again at dawn, Another withdrawal routed through an out-of-state bank. It was his habit, always moving money before the rest of the world had coffee. Priya had warned me to expect the pattern. Diversion, disguise, disappearance. She called it a magician's trick. The trick only works if the audience looks where you point. I was no longer his audience. I scrolled through Priya's spreadsheets, every cell color-coded, every transfer tracked. The totals staggered me. It wasn't just money gone missing from our household. She had traced funds pulled from the accounts of Daniel's elderly clients. Widows, retirees, people who trusted him, because he spoke with authority and wore loyalty like a tailored suit. One name stopped me cold: Mrs. Harper, a retired librarian I'd met at a community reading program, had trusted Daniel with her modest nest egg. He had drained half of it under the guise of temporary restructuring. I remembered the way she'd pressed a bookmark into my palm that day and said, "Stories protect us." The betrayal made my stomach knot. Theo knocked lightly before entering with 2 coffees. His eyes scanned the papers scattered across the desk. He didn't need numbers to understand. The tightness in my jaw said, "Enough." "Priya's right," he murmured. "He's not just hurting you, he's hunting people who can't fight back." The weight of that truth pressed heavier than my personal loss. I had always thought the battle was between Daniel and me, between his cruelty and my resilience. Now I saw it differently. He was a predator in a tailored suit, and the community was bleeding. I thought back to the times Daniel insisted on hosting charity galas. He loved standing at the microphone, praising generosity, shaking hands with donors, pretending to be the man who lifted others up. Meanwhile, he was stealing from the same people who applauded him. The duplicity made me feel sick. I remembered one gala when Ruth, his mother, boasted that her son had inherited his late father's integrity. She clasped my hand as if I should feel grateful to share his last name. I wanted to pull away but didn't. That night, Daniel locked the door when we returned home and reminded me in a low voice that appearances mattered more than truth. I heard the locks click like punctuation on a warning. Priya texted with updates every hour, each message a rope pulling me closer to solid ground. She had documented 2 years of irregular withdrawals, each transaction paired with supporting notes, emails, or forged authorizations Daniel had slipped past trusting clients. She included screen captures of him, logging into offshore accounts at odd hours. He had been planning an escape not just from our marriage but from justice itself. Priya's voice messages were calm, precise, almost soothing. "Paper tells the story people try to bury. We will let the paper speak." I closed the laptop and pressed my palms against the cool surface of the desk. My heart raced but my breath came steady. For the first time, I understood that exposing Daniel wasn't just survival. It was protection for people like Mrs. Harper, like the elderly couples who had smiled at me at galas and asked about my work. They deserved to know their trust had been weaponized. They deserved to see Daniel held accountable in a space larger than our home. Theo glanced at his watch. "Maya wants us at her office by 10. She says Judge Alvarez cleared a slot for an emergency petition." I nodded. My reflection in the mirror above the desk startled me. My eyes looked different, sharper, more certain. Daniel had spent years convincing me I was too fragile to stand in storms. Now I saw that storms cleared the air. This fight was bigger than me, and that gave me strength. The rain outside had slowed to a drizzle, the kind that lingers long after thunder has passed. I pulled on a dry coat, tucked my phone into the inside pocket, and gathered the folder of statements Priya had couriered overnight. The evidence felt heavier than paper should, as if it carried the weight of every small betrayal Daniel had stacked into a wall around me. I whispered to myself, "Today the wall cracks." Theo held the door open. Together we stepped into the light, leaving the damp hotel room behind. Every raindrop on the pavement felt like punctuation on a chapter closing, a chapter that Daniel never expected me to finish writing. Maya's office smelled faintly of lemon polish and strong coffee, the kind of place where serious work happened without distraction. She listened carefully as I handed her the folder of statements, her eyes narrowing as she skimmed the color-coded tabs. "This isn't just mismanagement," she said, tapping one page. "This is calculated theft. And paired with last night's recording, it paints a full picture." She drafted motions with her pen flying, while Theo leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching the door the way a soldier scans a horizon. The emergency petition was ready by noon, and by evening Judge Alvarez had granted a temporary freeze. For the first time in months, Daniel could not touch another dollar. It should have brought me relief. Instead, it stirred unease, because I knew he would sense the shift. That unease turned out to be well placed. After midnight, long after Theo had driven home to rest and I had finally drifted into shallow sleep at the hotel, I heard a knock. Not the polite kind, but the insistent rhythm of someone who felt entitled. My stomach dropped. I checked the peephole and saw Ruth, his mother, standing in the hallway, her coat wrapped tight, her hand already rummaging for something in her purse. She had a key in her fingers. My key. Or rather, the copy Daniel had pressed into her palm last spring with a smirk. "Family doesn't need permission," he had said. I had never forgotten. I opened the door just enough to block her entry with my body. "Ruth, it's late." Her expression carried that blend of superiority and concern she had perfected, the kind that disguised control as care. "I need to see you, Lena. You shouldn't be hiding here. Daniel is worried sick." The words dripped with practiced authority, but I could hear the tremor beneath. She pushed slightly, testing the gap, the copied key glittering in her hand. "He told me you'd be stubborn, that you might run off," he said, "to bring you home." I steadied my breath and forced calm into my voice. "This room isn't part of your son's house, Ruth. That key won't open this door." She froze, the reality dawning as her grip on the copy faltered. For a moment I thought she might argue, but instead she whispered, "You've embarrassed us. The whole family is talking." Her words hit like cold water. Embarrassment, not safety, was her concern. Generational pride disguised as loyalty. I could almost see the shadows of the values Daniel had inherited: reputation above truth, control above compassion. I took out my phone and pressed record. "Say that again, Ruth, that I've embarrassed you." She paled, realizing too late that her son's favorite tool, intimidation by implication, would now serve as evidence against them both. "This isn't necessary," she stammered, lowering her hand. "Just come home quietly, Daniel can explain." I stepped fully into the doorway, meeting her eyes. "He has already explained. Every withdrawal, every lie, every key copied behind my back. And now it's all in writing." Her composure cracked. For a second I saw fear not for me, but for the collapse of the family image she guarded like treasure. Without another word she tucked the key back into her purse and walked quickly down the hall. I closed the door, slid the chain into place, and leaned against it as my hands finally shook. Not from weakness, but from the jolt of facing the origin of Daniel's entitlement. Control didn't start with him. It had roots. Ruth had watered them for years. I sat at the desk, wrote down every detail, and emailed the file to Maya and Priya. Documentation again. Proof that intrusion ran deeper than finances. Then I placed the phone on the nightstand and lay back. Sleep didn't come easily, but resolve did. If Daniel thought he could teach me lessons, he had forgotten who else was capable of learning. The copied key had become a symbol. A line crossed. Tomorrow, it would become a weapon in court. Proof that their entire household believed I had no right to boundaries. I closed my eyes to the rhythm of rain against the glass, hearing not menace but a steady drumbeat of change. The morning after Ruth's uninvited appearance, I sat with Harper at a diner off the highway. She looked worn, eyes ringed with fatigue, fingers tapping nervously against her coffee cup. Debt had a way of aging her faster than years ever could. I could still see the kid sister who once followed me around barefoot in the backyard, but now she was a woman buried under the weight of choices that Daniel had used like shackles. He paid them, Lena, she said quietly, her gaze fixed on the chipped formica table. The men I owed. He cleared the slate and told me all he wanted in return was information. About Mom, about the trust, about you. Her voice cracked on the last word. I felt my stomach tighten. I had suspected Daniel's reach had found its way into Harper's weakness, but hearing it confirmed was different. He hadn't just exploited me. He had fed off the cracks in my family, widening them with quiet precision. Did he threaten you? I asked. She shook her head. Number worse. He acted like a savior. Told me I wasn't reliable with money, that you shouldn't be burdened with family secrets. He played it like he was protecting you. I thought of our mother, Evelyn, who still lived in the old house with its porch swing and creaking floorboards. Her memory slipped, sometimes she lost track of dates, forgot recipes she once knew by heart. But her dignity remained, fierce and intact. Daniel had noticed her lapses before anyone else. He catalogued them, turning them into leverage. He framed her forgetfulness as incompetence, suggested she was unfit to manage her own affairs. It was a familiar tactic. Strip someone of credibility, then seize control under the guise of concern. When I visited her later that day, she was sitting in her chair by the window, crocheting uneven stitches with quiet determination. She looked up, eyes sharpening with recognition that didn't always come. "You're carrying something heavy," she said. I knelt beside her. "Daniel's been moving money, Mom, using Harper's debt as a doorway." Her fingers stilled. "I told your father once that men like him see weakness as invitation. That's why your father left things the way he did." She pulled open the drawer in the side table and handed me an envelope, yellowed at the edges. Inside were notes in my father's handwriting, instructions about a safety deposit box, hints at documents he feared would be needed one day. "We kept it quiet for your protection," she said. Tears burned at the corners of my eyes. Even in her fading clarity, she had guarded me, just as my father had. Generational strength passed through small, deliberate acts Daniel had underestimated. That night, as I lay in the hotel again, I thought about the fault lines that ran through families. Debt, pride, secrecy, loyalty, all could be twisted into chains. Daniel had weaponized them. But he had miscalculated. Because while he saw Harper's weakness and Mom's forgetfulness, he failed to see the resilience that came from generations surviving worse storms than his manipulation. I whispered to myself as I drifted to sleep. He thinks we are divided. He doesn't see that cracks can also be where the light enters. By the time Friday arrived, whispers had already begun to ripple through town. In the school parking lot, while I waited for Harper's son to come bounding out with his backpack, I caught the sideways glances. Parents who once greeted me warmly now looked at me with polite curiosity. Their voices pitched just low enough to suggest the gossip wasn't meant for my ears. "Daniel's firm is under review. Something about client money. I heard Lena checked into a hotel alone." It was astonishing how fast speculation traveled. I smiled at them anyway, refusing to shrink. Pretending strength was no longer pretending it was practice. And practice, I had learned, becomes truth over time. Later that afternoon, I walked into the PTA meeting at the elementary school, the smell of paste and pencil shavings familiar and grounding. The meeting agenda was supposed to be about the spring fundraiser, but the murmurs about Daniel's absence swallowed the room. He had always loved these events, parading as the polished father who donated just enough to be praised. Without him there, his absence was louder than any presence could have been. One of the moms leaned toward me, her tone dripping with a mixture of curiosity and pity. "We heard Daniel's tied up with business troubles. You must be so stressed, dear." I met her eyes steadily. "Stress is temporary. Integrity lasts longer." The room went quiet for a beat. Then the chairwoman cleared her throat and moved on to scheduling bake sales. But I knew the silence meant the story was already bigger than I could contain. That evening, Priya called with a tone both cautious and exhilarated. "The charity gala next weekend will be critical," she said. "Daniel's name is still on the donor list, but the freeze on his accounts means he won't have the funds to play benefactor. people will notice. If we time this right, the public unraveling starts there. Theo, who was sitting across the table from me, leaned in. Public exposure matters. Daniel's spent years convincing everyone he's untouchable. Strip that away in front of his peers, and his shield cracks faster than any courtroom blow. I thought back to the last gala I had attended at his side. He wore a navy suit, glass of champagne in hand, speaking with that easy confidence that fooled even seasoned investors. I had stood beside him in sequins that suddenly felt like armor turned inward, smiling at jokes that weren't funny, nodding at praise that wasn't earned. That night, I had overheard two wives whisper about how lucky I was to be married to a man so generous. I had wanted to tell them generosity is only real when it doesn't demand obedience in return. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same gala he once used to polish his reputation would now become a stage for truth. Maya had already arranged for certain documents to be available if needed. Bank statements, recordings, copies of the forged authorizations. She called it controlled exposure. Enough to turn heads, not so much as to violate the legal process. It was a delicate balance, but one we were prepared for. That night, lying in bed at the hotel, I imagined the chandelier-lit ballroom, the hum of polite laughter, the glasses raised in toasts. And then I imagined the moment those glasses froze mid-air, when the story shifted and Daniel's curated image fractured in real time. Public payoff. Justice not only delivered but witnessed. The thought carried me to sleep with a strange peace. The storm outside had calmed, replaced by a moon that slipped between the clouds. I whispered into the stillness, "You built your power on appearances, Daniel, but appearances are fragile. And next week, they will shatter." The courthouse was a monument of stone and glass that seemed designed to make people feel small. I walked through its revolving doors with Theo on one side and Maya on the other, their presence steadying me like the bookends of a fragile volume. Inside, the echo of footsteps reminded me that time itself was a participant here, pressing us forward whether we were ready or not. Judge Alvarez entered the chamber with the kind of quiet authority that didn't need raised voices. She adjusted her glasses, read the petition, and listened as Maya laid out the facts. Abandonment, financial manipulation, copied keys, irregular transfers, and the mounting evidence of client exploitation. Daniel's attorney had filed a last-minute request for delay, citing miscommunication, but Alvarez cut through the excuse with a sharp, "Request denied. This matter is urgent." The hearing moved quickly. Maya presented the audio clip of Daniel telling me to get out of the car and walk. His voice filled the courtroom, steady and cold. "You need a lesson, Lena. Respect is earned by obedience." I didn't look at him. I watched the judge's jaw tighten instead, a tiny signal that his words had struck exactly where we needed them to. When Priya wheeled in 2 suitcases of documents, the room shifted. She spread out records across the evidence table, color-coded like a library of deceit. Transfers to shell accounts, wire records to Caribbean banks, notes in Daniel's own handwriting authorizing withdrawals under fabricated justifications. It wasn't just our household's money. The files showed names of retirees, widows, even a church endowment account that he had siphoned with surgical precision. The judge signed the injunction swiftly. All accounts frozen, Daniel barred from accessing funds, exclusive use of the marital home granted to me. It was a victory, but it also started a clock. Daniel thrived on control, and now control had been ripped from his hands. Desperation makes men reckless, and reckless men make mistakes, but they also lash out. As we left the courtroom, I caught sight of Ruth in the hallway. She stood ramrod straight, pearls at her throat, her lips pressed into a thin line. In her hand, she clutched that copied key like a talisman. When our eyes met, she shook her head slowly, a gesture not of apology but of warning. "You may have won a battle, but you've embarrassed the family." I walked past her without a word. Silence can be louder than confrontation. Back at the hotel, Theo checked the locks for the 3rd time, while Maya placed the court orders into a safe box. Priya sat cross-legged on the bed, scrolling through her laptop with the calm of someone piecing together a puzzle whose edges were finally visible. "This is only the start," she said softly. "The federal regulators will circle once these filings hit their radar. By the gala, the story will already be moving beyond whispers." I sat in the armchair and pulled the blanket around me, exhaustion wrapping tighter than the fabric. But beneath it was a pulse of determination. The hearing hadn't just frozen assets, it had thawed the silence I'd been living in. For years, Daniel had dictated the script, choosing when I spoke, when I smiled, when I was silent. Today, the narrative had shifted, and I was no longer an extra in his production. The clock was ticking, yes, but it was ticking toward a reckoning he never imagined. I whispered it to myself as if sealing a vow. Every second brings me closer to his undoing. 2 days after the injunction, I drove with Theo to the First National downtown, a modest building of marble columns that looked more like a relic than a bank. The manager, an older man with kind eyes named Mr. Callahan, ushered us into a quiet back room once I showed him the envelope my mother had given me. He treated the small brass key with a reverence that made me realize my father's foresight had not gone unnoticed. "Your dad asked me to hold this box for you," he said softly. "He told me one day you might need proof more than sentiment." Inside the chilled vault, the safety deposit box slid open with a metallic groan. What lay inside was not jewelry or heirlooms but a paper trail neatly stacked files, each with my father's handwriting on sticky notes. He had labeled them like breadcrumbs through a forest of deceit. Loan application forged with Lena's signature. Transfer authorization prepared but never filed. Deed to lake cabin, attempted sale blocked by attorney. My breath caught at the meticulousness. My father must have sensed something about Daniel long before I did. One document froze me completely. A power of attorney form with my name scrawled across the bottom in a signature that looked close to mine but bent wrong at the edges. I touched it with the tip of my finger, heat rising through me. "He tried to erase me legally," I whispered. Theo's jaw flexed as he snapped photos of every page with his phone, cataloging evidence that would one day choke Daniel's defenses. On one of the sticky notes, my father had written a single line: "He will try to take everything, don't let him." The weight of those words pressed into my chest like a legacy, not of wealth but of vigilance. He had seen the pattern, even when love had blinded me. Driving back from the bank, rain tapping softly on the windshield, Theo spoke carefully. "This isn't just about you anymore. If he forged your signature, he could do it to clients too. Priya's spreadsheets are just the beginning." His words sank deep. Daniel's abuse wasn't confined to our marriage, it was systemic, sprawling, designed to bleed anyone vulnerable enough to trust him. That evening, I spread the documents across the hotel desk, piecing them together like a mosaic of betrayal. Maya called, her voice clipped but charged with energy. "Judge Alvarez needs this in her chambers first thing tomorrow. Forgery is a line no court overlooks. It changes custody battles, property fights, everything. This isn't just financial abuse, it's criminal fraud with intent." I pressed my palm flat against the forged power of attorney, anger burning steady but clean. For years, Daniel had told me I was careless with money, incapable of understanding contracts, naive about the world. Now the very papers he had tried to weaponize against me would become the instruments of his undoing. Before bed, I wrote in my journal the words I hadn't said out loud. "Dad, I listened. I won't let him take everything. I will finish what you started when you locked these papers away." Closing the book, I felt the storm clouds of grief and fury merge into something new, resolve that no forged line could erase. The morning broke heavy with gray clouds, but inside the courthouse the air crackled with momentum. Maya walked beside me, her heels striking sharp against the marble floor, as if each step hammered another nail into Daniel's carefully constructed image. The forged documents from the safety deposit box had been submitted overnight. Judge Alvarez wasted no time. She summoned both parties and announced the evidence would be admitted for review. Daniel's face shifted from annoyance to alarm, a flicker I caught even as he tried to mask it with a lawyer's practiced poker stare. When Priya presented her charts, color-coded and precise, the room leaned forward. Transfers to offshore accounts, withdrawals disguised as consulting fees, a forged deed to the cabin my grandmother had left me. Every line built a case not of error but of orchestration. Daniel's attorney objected to the speed of the proceedings, claiming they needed time to verify. Judge Alvarez shook her head. What we have here is more than circumstantial. This is deliberate fraud. My duty is to protect the victims, including Mrs. Carter. She ordered Daniel to surrender his passport immediately. That was the moment federal investigators, who had been quietly watching from the back, stepped forward. One of them, sharp suit, badge flashing, approached the bench. Your Honor, we have an active warrant. Mr. Whitaker is under investigation for wire fraud and elder exploitation. We request he be remanded into custody. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Daniel's mask cracked fully then. He turned toward me, his voice rising above the chaos. You set me up, Lena? This is all a performance. The bailiff placed a firm hand on his shoulder, pressing him back into his seat. Alvarez's gavel cut the air. Enough. The evidence speaks louder than your words. Within an hour, Daniel was led out in handcuffs, cameras waiting just beyond the courthouse steps. Reporters shouted questions that blurred into a single chorus: embezzlement, fraud, betrayal. By evening, his mugshot flashed across local news channels, his once polished hair mussed, his tailored suit replaced with county-issued gray. Back at the hotel, Theo pulled up social media feeds on his laptop. The story had gone viral. Former clients were flooding forums and Facebook groups, posting stories of missing funds and brushed-off concerns. One woman wrote, "He told me I'd authorized the withdrawal. I thought maybe I'd forgotten. Now I see he was gaslighting me like the rest." Others chimed in, their anger rising not in isolation but in unison. By midnight, a coalition had formed: clients, retirees, even employees who had once feared retaliation. They were drafting a collective statement demanding restitution, not just from Daniel but from the entire firm that enabled him. Maya leaned over my shoulder, reading the draft aloud. We, the undersigned, refuse to be silent. Her voice carried a note of satisfaction, the kind that comes from watching silence shatter. I sat back, overwhelmed but steady. For years, Daniel had convinced me I was alone in my doubts, a solitary skeptic in a world that adored him. Now the truth had drawn others into the light. Their voices joined mine, louder than any courtroom declaration. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, but inside the room there was a rare calm. Theo poured coffee into chipped mugs, Priya scribbled follow-up notes, and Maya outlined the next steps. The storm Daniel had unleashed no longer felt like chaos. It felt like justice gathering its chorus. For the first time since the night he left me at that overlook, I believed something unshakable. He wasn't just losing his power over me, he was losing his power over everyone. The courtroom felt colder that morning, though sunlight streamed through high windows like indifferent witnesses. Rows of reporters filled the back, their pens and cameras poised to catch every misstep. I sat between Maya and Theo, my hands folded on the table, the forged documents, bank records, and recordings stacked neatly in front of us. Daniel walked in wearing a suit that no longer fit as it once had, the collar too loose around his thinning frame. He carried himself with the same arrogance, but his eyes betrayed something new, panic dressed as defiance. The prosecution began with the forensic accountant's testimony. Priya, steady and methodical, explained how millions had been siphoned into shell accounts. She broke down the mechanics with clarity that even the jurors with no financial background could follow. Each chart she presented felt like a nail hammered into Daniel's defense. His attorney objected, claiming bias, but Judge Alvarez overruled, her gaze fixed firmly on the evidence. Then came the testimony, no one expected so soon. Daniel's mistress, Clara. She entered the room in plain clothes, nothing like the designer dresses she once flaunted. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied as she described how Daniel had promised her a future, all while confiding in her about the very crimes now on display. She pulled out her phone and offered recordings conversations where Daniel bragged about moving money undetected, where he mocked me as too naive to notice, and where he detailed plans to vanish overseas once he had bled enough accounts dry. The jury leaned forward, and I felt the shift like a current in the room. Daniel tried to keep his composure, but his face flushed red as Clara spoke. At one point, he muttered something under his breath, and Maya pounced. "Your Honor, may the record reflect the defendant attempted to intimidate a witness in open court?" Alvarez's gavel came down sharp. "Mr. Whitaker, another word and I will hold you in contempt." As if that weren't enough, 2 interns from his firm took the stand next. Young, nervous, but armed with printed emails and saved messages. They testified that Daniel had instructed them to alter records, to clean up numbers before regulators glanced too closely. One of them, barely 22, confessed she had quit after sleepless nights worrying she might be complicit in fraud. Her voice cracked when she admitted she had been too afraid to speak until she heard about my case. "I thought no one would believe me," she whispered. Each testimony built a picture larger than my marriage, larger than my own suffering. It showed a pattern: exploitation, intimidation, systemic abuse of trust. This wasn't the story of one cruel husband. It was the unmasking of a predator in a community suit, a man who wielded financial jargon like a weapon and family ties like collateral. When the judge called recess, I sat quietly while murmurs buzzed around us like bees disturbed from their hive. Theo leaned closer, his voice low. "He's crumbling in front of them. Not just the jury, everyone." I nodded, feeling the weight of vindication settle slowly, carefully, like a cloak I hadn't yet earned the right to wear. But I also felt something more: resolve that the story wasn't just about punishment. It was about showing every person who had doubted themselves under Daniel's charm that their instincts were right. As the bailiff announced lunch break, I looked over at Daniel. For the first time, he didn't look back. He stared at the table, his knuckles white against the polished wood. Control had slipped through his hands, and the pattern of abuse he had perfected for years was finally visible to all. The gala glittered under chandeliers that hung like frozen fireworks. For years, Daniel had used this event to polish his reputation, standing at the podium with a glass of champagne and a grin that convinced donors he was their golden boy. Tonight, the room belonged to someone else. My name was still on the guest list, not as an accessory to his image but as a participant in exposing it. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same ballroom where he once lectured me about keeping quiet would now echo with truths too sharp to ignore. I entered on Theo's arm, Maya close behind, and Priya already weaving through the crowd with quiet confidence. Eyes followed us, some curious, some sympathetic, others sharpened by gossip. Whispers carried my name like a fragile ornament passed from hand to hand. At the center of it all, Ruth stood near the buffet table, her pearls gleaming under the lights. Clutched in her hand was the copied key, as if gripping it could still grant her authority over me. The program began with routine speeches, but halfway through, Maya signaled the MC. Papers rustled. The lights dimmed slightly as the projector hummed to life. "Ladies and gentlemen," the MC said carefully, "before we continue, there are matters of transparency that must be addressed." A murmur rippled through the audience. Priya stepped to the microphone, calm and direct. She presented charts showing irregular withdrawals, money siphoned from accounts that had been pledged for community projects. Gasps rose when the names appeared on the screen: the church endowment, the senior center, even a scholarship fund. These weren't faceless numbers, they were promises broken in the very room built on trust. Then it was my turn. I walked to the stage, heels steady on polished wood. The spotlight washed over me, but instead of shrinking, I let it hold me. "Many of you knew my husband as a man of generosity," I began, my voice clear. "But generosity cannot exist where manipulation lives." For years, Daniel used keys, real and metaphorical, to invade spaces that weren't his. He copied a house key for his mother, telling her family didn't need permission. Tonight, I returned that key. I held up the very copy Ruth had tried to use at my hotel room. Gasps rippled across the tables. I placed it on the podium, metal clicking against wood, louder than any gavel. Boundaries are not burdens, consent is not optional, and privacy is not a gift to be revoked at whim. From the back, Ruth's voice rang out, quivering with rage. "You're humiliating this family!" The room turned toward her. I met her gaze, unflinching. "No, Ruth. Daniel did that when he abandoned me in a storm and stole from the very people gathered here tonight." Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came. For the first time, her authority failed her. A man in the crowd stood, Mr. Callahan, the bank manager who had safeguarded my father's documents. He spoke clearly. "I can confirm Mrs. Carter's account. Her father anticipated this betrayal and left evidence to protect her." His words carried weight, the kind that silenced doubt. Then Clara, Daniel's former mistress, approached the stage. She held her phone aloft. "I have recordings too. He promised me the same future he stole from all of you." The crowd erupted, not with applause but with sharp voices demanding answers. What once had been polite applause for Daniel now turned into public reckoning. I closed with words I hadn't rehearsed but felt rising from the deepest part of me. Power without integrity is theft. Tonight, I stand not as Daniel's wife but as Lena Carter, daughter, sister, and a woman who refuses silence. This is not about revenge. This is about truth standing where lies once held court. The room rose in a standing ovation, not the polite kind, but the fervent kind that comes when people realize they have been freed from a performance they never consented to. Ruth dropped the key into her clutch and slipped toward the exit. I didn't stop her. The payoff wasn't her humiliation. It was the collective recognition that Daniel's empire had always been built on borrowed trust, and tonight, the trust was finally returned to its rightful owners. The sentencing hearing felt less like a courtroom and more like a theater of reckoning. Rows of former clients filled the benches, their faces lined with the weight of betrayal and the hunger for closure. Judge Alvarez presided with the same steady authority she had shown from the start. When Daniel entered in his wrinkled suit, shackled at the wrists, the silence in the room was heavier than any storm. He no longer looked like the man who once charmed gala donors. He looked like a man cornered by his own lies. The prosecutor outlined the charges: wire fraud, elder exploitation, forgery, financial abuse. Each count read like a drumbeat, pounding away the last fragments of his curated image. Then came the testimonies. Mrs. Harper, the retired librarian, spoke softly about how Daniel had convinced her she was forgetting withdrawals she never made. A church treasurer described how promised funds for youth programs had vanished. Even Clara returned to the stand, voice steady as she admitted her complicity and her awakening. The jury had already spoken, but these voices gave flesh and bone to the crimes, ensuring Daniel's sentence would not be abstract. When it was my turn, I walked to the podium, holding my notes but speaking mostly from memory. "For years, Daniel taught me lessons," I said. "Lessons in obedience, silence, and shame. But the real lesson is this: cruelty destroys itself. Every lie becomes evidence. Every theft becomes testimony. And every storm, no matter how violent, clears the air." I turned toward him. "You thought leaving me in the rain would break me. Instead, it freed me." Judge Alvarez delivered the sentence with no hesitation: 12 years in federal prison, restitution of misused funds, and a lifetime ban from financial management. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom, but I felt only stillness, like a tide settling after the crash of waves. Daniel's eyes flickered toward me as the bailiffs led him away. He mouthed words I didn't need to hear. His voice no longer held power. The following months were a blur of paperwork, civil suits, and media noise. Clients banded together, and with Maya's strategy, most reclaimed their stolen funds. Priya worked tirelessly, ensuring restitution was more than a legal promise. Theo kept his quiet guard, reminding me that safety is not just legal protection but lived presence. Harper found sobriety in accountability, joining a support group, and paying forward her hard lessons. Even Ruth, stripped of denial, withdrew into silence. The copied key she once wielded like a badge now sat in a sealed evidence envelope, its purpose served. But the story did not end in court. It needed a future. With restitution funds and a whistleblower award, I established the Ember Foundation in a renovated brick building downtown. The name carried meaning. Embers are what remain after fire, the sparks that can reignite hope. Our mission was simple but profound: provide financial literacy, legal aid, and safe exits for those caught in cycles of control and abuse. On opening day, the lobby filled with women clutching folders, children holding tight to their mothers' coats, and volunteers ready to serve. Priya set up an office lined with spreadsheets and color-coded files, turning numbers into shields. Maya carved out a legal aid wing, her voice now a weapon for those who had none. Theo handled security, installing panic buttons and monitoring cameras with the same vigilance he once used on night drives. Even Harper joined, answering phones and leading support groups, her voice raw but honest as she said, "I know what it's like to believe you're too broken to matter. You're not." Months later, at our first fundraising gala, the same ballroom where Daniel's image had once reigned, I stood at the podium, this time not alone, but surrounded by allies. Behind me, a wall displayed photographs of women who had rebuilt their lives: teachers, nurses, students, mothers. Each smile was a rebuttal to the cruelty that once thrived in silence. I held up the framed letter Daniel had sent me from prison, filled with bitterness and blame, the final echo of his control. It hung in my office now, not as a wound but as a reminder. He thought he was teaching me a lesson, I told the crowd. But the true lesson is this: when you refuse to be broken, you become the shelter for others. The applause was thunderous, not for me but for the collective victory. Justice was no longer just about one woman in the rain. It was about a community reclaiming its dignity, a family finding its strength, and a foundation born from embers burning bright. As I looked out over the crowd, I felt the truth settle deep. Every subplot had closed, every storm had passed, and every open wound had become part of a scar strong enough to hold the weight of others.